Today we're going to talk about Henry Ford, the progressive. I love Henry Ford. He is somebody who has significantly changed the world, probably, at least in this area, more so than almost anybody. To be honest, full disclosure, I've worked at Henry Ford Museum since I was 16 years old. I've had a number of jobs there in very different capacities throughout the years. And in that process, I've gotten to know a whole lot about Henry Ford. Now, that's not saying I like everything about Henry Ford. There were certainly many drawbacks to him, and we'll talk about those at the end. But overall, what Henry Ford did for the modern worker and for modern American society, it's very hard to challenge that he was quite the great man as far as changing our lives and really improving the lives of most workers goes. So, first of all, Henry Ford the progressive. We could talk a lot about Henry Ford the man and a lot of things that Henry Ford did, but what we're going to focus on is Henry Ford as he works as a progressive. And we know goal number 4 of the progressives is to foster efficiency, to make things more efficient, get more stuff done in a shorter amount of time. And so where Henry Ford really did this is the assembly line. I hope I'm not the first to break it to you, but Henry Ford did not invent the automobile. Henry Ford didn't even invent the assembly line. He just perfected the assembly line. He made it much better. He used the scientific method. He used looking at logic and reason to try to improve and make a system more efficient. He copied a system that was being used on meat packaging plants in Chicago, and he used that to do his automobile design and found out that it was actually pretty quick. And so perhaps Henry Ford's greatest contribution is the moving assembly line. Now again, he didn't invent the moving assembly line. The assembly line was around before Henry Ford, meat packaging plants in Chicago. But what Henry Ford did is he perfected the assembly line. And by doing this, he lowered the cost of the automobile. He made it cheaper and much more affordable to buy an automobile, and a high quality automobile at that. Second thing that Henry Ford did is he worked on efficiency by reducing the amount of hours per day that workers would work. He reduced the amount of hours each worker would work from an average day of 9 hours a day to 8 hours a day. Now, if you're thinking, well, that's pretty weird, why would he do that? You want to take a guess? See, the car was so popular and the assembly line was so popular, Henry Ford wanted to fit not 2 shifts a day, but Henry Ford wanted to fit 3 shifts a day. He wanted to be able to build more cars, and so if you're working 9 hours a day, you can have a full 3rd shift. Henry Ford added the 3rd shift by reducing the workday to 8 hours. Of course, this makes his employees happy. They're happy because they don't have to work as much. Remember, people in factories prior to this working in terrible working conditions, working in ridiculous working conditions, and Henry Ford revolutionized that. He said, all right, you're still going to work in pretty rough conditions, but we'll reduce the workday to 8 hours a day instead of 9, and as a result, some workers were very thankful for him reducing the tedious amount of labor. Now, at the end of the day, maybe it was a selfish move because, again, he could fit in a 3rd shift in the day, and that made him more money in the long run. So one of the remarkable things Henry Ford did is he raised his daily wages for his workers to $5 a day. Prior to that, the average worker was making about $2.40 a day, maybe $2.50 a day, and he raised that wage to $5, more than doubling it. Now, sounds pretty generous on the part of Henry Ford, but he did it for a number of reasons. Some of them selfish, some of them selfish. Henry Ford raised wages, number 1, because the work in the factories was miserable. He couldn't keep enough workers. Workers were quitting every day. He'd hire a bunch of workers. They'd quit usually within about 1 to 2 weeks because the labor was so tedious. It was difficult labor. And what made it worse is it's sort of boring, repetitive labor. Doing the same thing over and over and over again on an assembly line is not a whole lot of fun. And so workers just got sick of doing the same thing all day, every day, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. It just became too much. And so they would quit rather quickly. So in order to try to entice people to stay, Henry Ford raised the wage to $5 a day. By doubling wages, he no longer had people who wanted to quit. Now all of a sudden people wanted to stick with Henry Ford and his company, not because they liked the labor, but if you're paying more than twice of what everybody else is, it's probably worth your while. So Henry Ford made a very drastic move that people couldn't believe in 1914. He raised the offer of the daily pay to $5 a day. Another reason why Henry Ford did this, again, a more selfish point of view, not just looking out for the betterment of the workers, but if employees had more money, those employees could take the more money that they had and they could buy more cars. They could actually afford to buy his cars. Remember, a car was quite the luxury vehicle in 1914. Most people from even a middle-class family would have struggled to buy a car. On the other hand, when Henry Ford doubles wages, now all of a sudden all these people who could never afford to buy cars before, now they can afford to buy cars. And guess whose cars they're going to buy? You guessed it, Henry Ford's. So now he's basically making most of that money back when people are buying his cars. So he's paying workers more money, but they're spending that money on his cars. Now, again, Henry Ford, not always the nicest of men. Henry Ford, one of the big things against him, he was very much an anti-Semite. He very much disliked Jewish people, which is one of the major faults of Henry Ford, one of the things that I don't respect about him. And then the other thing that's probably a little bit less than respectful of Henry Ford is the way he treated his employees. Now, while Henry Ford was doubling wages, while he was paying $5 a day, he expected strict loyalty from his employees. He would not put up with employees who were disloyal to him. And so he wanted to make sure that every employee met his own personal specifications before hiring them. If you wanted a job with Henry Ford, you had to learn English. And so you had to take English language classes. It didn't mean you had to speak English when you first got hired, but if you didn't speak English, you would have to enroll in English language classes to learn how to speak English. So much for keeping your own culture. Another thing that Henry Ford did is investigated the financial records of all his employees. He wanted to make sure that they were good with money and that they weren't going to waste his money and they weren't going to turn into drunks. Henry Ford was not a fan of alcohol, not a fan of drinking. And so one of the things that he did was he had his people look into the personal financial records and backgrounds of his employees. And another thing he did is he investigated the moral character of his employee. Again, Henry Ford was a pretty clean-cut man. As much as he was kind of a thug and had his employees sort of whipped into shape, you can see in the photo, a few of Henry Ford's employees tried to form a union once. Henry Ford was not a big fan of anybody who tried to form a union because he already thought that he was treating his workers better than anybody else had ever treated workers before. And so whenever somebody tried to question what Henry Ford was doing, he would get pretty angry. But again, if he's going to pay him more money, one of the things that he wanted was he wanted people of good moral character. He wanted people with a good, wholesome background, and so he'd look into the character of his employees. And by today's standards, we might see that as something that's unjust or unfair or not the right thing to do. But at the time, because he was paying more than double the average wage, he could get away with it. Finally, a result of Henry Ford's $5 day, and not just as a result of the $5 day, there are a ton of other factors, but one of the major things that happens as a result of the $5 day is what is known as the Great Migration. And so when Henry Ford and other people need people to work in their factories, they start advertising all around the country saying, we need workers, we need people to come to our factories up in the north. And the people who heed the call are mainly African Americans. There are over 6 million African Americans in the period of the early 1900s who will leave their homes in the South and they will move to northern cities in order to take jobs. Not only do they want to get better paying jobs, high paying jobs, and there's lots of factory work available, especially after the outbreak of the war, but another thing that they want is they just want to get away from discrimination. With Jim Crow laws and with some of the nasty things going on in the South, many African Americans want out as quickly as they possibly can. And so when the prospect of good high-paying jobs in the North is found, many African Americans will leave the South and move to the North. Well, that's all we have to say about Henry Ford for today. We'll talk more about Henry Ford and Henry Ford the man in the future. I hope you have a great day.